the heavy lead apron pressed into my collarbones, the smell of sterile iodine and bone dust filling the trauma bay as the first straight man to ever make me lose my mind asked me a question that had absolutely nothing to do with saving a life. I am an orthopedic trauma surgeon. My entire existence revolves around reconstructing shattered pieces, analyzing fracture patterns, and making immediate, emotionless decisions while standing in pools of other people's disasters. I do not do ambiguity. I do not do guessing games. And I certainly do not entertain men who treat my identity like a late night puzzle they are too terrified to solve in the daylight. Hey guys, before we dive deeper into the chaos of the trauma ward, do me a huge favor and drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you are listening from. It helps the channel out a lot, and I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. All right, back to the emergency room. His name was Declan, Captain Declan Hayes, the lead pilot for the regional medevac helicopter unit that operated directly off the roof of our hospital. He was a man built out of aviation fuel, military discipline, and a quiet, imposing authority that commanded the room the second his heavy flight boots hit the linoleum. We had shared airspace for 6 months. He brought me the broken bodies from mountainsides and highway pileups, and I put them back together. Our relationship was professional, brief, and completely devoid of personal attachments. I had 3 strict rules when it came to the flight crews. Do not socialize with the adrenaline junkies. Do not mistake their high-stress camaraderie for actual friendship. And above all, never, under any circumstances, let yourself look too closely at the ruggedly handsome pilot who casually mentions his ex-girlfriends while filling out flight logs. But that Tuesday night, the rules began to fracture. We had just stabilized a hiker who took a 50-foot fall. The trauma bay was finally quiet, the monitors humming a steady rhythm. I was at the stainless steel sink, aggressively scrubbing the dried blood out from under my fingernails, trying to bring my heart rate down. The doors slid open behind me. I expected a nurse. Instead, the reflection in the glass mirror showed Declan. He was still wearing his olive green flight suit, the reflective patches catching the harsh fluorescent light. He smelled like cold, high-altitude wind, jet fuel, and sweat. He did not immediately speak. He just leaned his broad shoulders against the doorframe, watching me scrub. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 38 years old, openly gay since medical school, and completely exhausted by straight men who view my orientation as a fascinating sociological study. I kept scrubbing, pretending his presence did not make the air in the small room feel significantly thinner. "Patient is stable, Captain," I said, keeping my voice entirely clinical. "You can file the transport paperwork." Declan shifted his weight. His flight helmet dangled from his large right hand. He looked at the floor, then at the wall, then finally at my reflection in the mirror. "Hey, Doc," he started, his voice a low gravel that vibrated over the sound of the running water. "Can I ask you something completely out of line?" I stiffened. I knew that tone. I had heard it at medical conferences, in locker rooms, in elevator rides. It was the tone of a man preparing to ask a question he wanted the answer to, but lacked the courage to own. "That depends entirely on how out of line it is, Declan," I replied, turning the tap off and reaching for a harsh paper towel. The silence stretched. The distant wail of an ambulance siren echoed from the street below. Declan stepped fully into the room, closing the door just a fraction, not entirely shut, just enough to block out the noise of the hallway. "When two guys," he cleared his throat, his eyes locking onto a loose tile near the sink. "When two guys go out, how do they know who is supposed to make the first move?" I froze. The damp paper towel crumpled in my fist. The question was so absurdly out of context, so completely disconnected from the blood and chaos we had just waded through, that my brain misfired. I looked at him. His face was entirely serious. There was no smirk, no locker room baiting, no arrogant curiosity. There was only a rigid, terrified tension in his jaw. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a helicopter skid, staring down at a dark void. "Excuse me?" I managed to say. Declan ran his free hand through his short, sandy blonde hair. He suddenly looked everywhere except at me. I just, I mean, there is no script, right? With a guy and a girl, there is a script, an expectation. I was just wondering how it works when the script is gone. I tossed the paper towel into the biohazard bin. I needed to shut this down. The absolute last thing I needed was to become the emotional sounding board for a straight pilot having a late night philosophical crisis about gender roles. "Whoever has the nerve to speak up first," I said sharply. "That is how it works. Now, if you will excuse me, I have post-op notes to dictate." I walked past him, making sure our shoulders did not brush. I expected him to laugh it off, to make a joke about how complicated that sounded. Instead, as I crossed the threshold into the hallway, I heard him exhale a long, unsteady breath. "That sounds terrifying," he whispered, almost to himself. I did not stop walking, but my chest tightened painfully. That was how the trouble actually began. Over the next 4 weeks, my carefully structured shifts began to unravel. Declan suddenly started existing in the spaces I thought belonged only to me. I took my coffee breaks at 4 in the morning in the deserted rooftop cafeteria, specifically because no one else was ever there. Suddenly, the heavy metal door would creak open, and Declan would wander in, flight suit half unzipped, carrying 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee. He would slide one across the table to me without a word and sit opposite me. He never intruded on my space, but his presence was a physical weight in the room. He learned my habits with the terrifying precision of a military pilot mapping a hostile terrain. He noticed that I rubbed my left wrist when a surgery went longer than 6 hours. He noticed that I refused to eat the cafeteria sandwiches, but would aggressively consume stale graham crackers from the pediatric ward. And in return, I found myself involuntarily memorizing him. I learned that he had a slight limp in his left leg when it rained, a souvenir from a rough landing years ago. I learned that he tapped his thumb against his coffee cup exactly 3 times before taking a sip. I was furious with myself. I am a professional. I reconstruct human architecture. I do not romanticize flight crews. One evening, the hospital hosted its mandatory annual charity gala. It was a miserable affair in a rented ballroom downtown, filled with local politicians, hospital administrators, and exhausted medical staff forced into formal wear. I arrived late, wearing a dark navy suit that felt too tight across the shoulders, planning to show my face, eat a terrible piece of dry chicken, and leave. I walked into the ballroom and stopped dead. Standing by the ice sculpture was Declan. He was wearing a tailored black tuxedo that completely erased the rugged, oil-stained pilot I knew, replacing him with something sharp, dangerous, and impossibly elegant. He was surrounded by a group of trauma nurses, all of them laughing at something he said. I moved toward the darkest corner of the room, near the emergency exit, hoping to go unnoticed. It took him exactly 4 minutes to find me. "Doc," his voice came from right behind my left shoulder. I turned, my drink almost spilling. The heat radiating from him was palpable. "You look entirely miserable," he observed, his eyes scanning my suit, lingering for a fraction of a second on my collar before meeting my eyes. I despise forced socialization. I replied, taking a slow sip of my drink to mask the sudden acceleration of my pulse. Declan chuckled, leaning his back against the wall next to me. We stood side by side, watching the crowd. The music was loud, making it necessary to lean in close to be heard. "Have you ever brought a date to one of these things?" Declan asked. His tone was casual, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his glass. I looked straight ahead. No, I prefer to keep my private life entirely separated from this hospital. People talk too much. Declan was quiet for a long time. The bass from the music thumped against the floorboards. "Is it hard?" he finally asked, his voice dropping low, intended only for my ears. "Keeping everything compartmentalized, never letting anyone see the whole picture?" I turned to look at him. His blue eyes were fixed on me, intense and searching. "It is a survival mechanism, Declan. You learn early on that people will use whatever they know about you to put you in a box. I prefer to build my own boxes." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "What if someone wants to see the whole picture? What if they want to know the things you keep in the dark?" The air between us completely evaporated. I could feel the warmth of his breath. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted to grab the lapels of his tuxedo and drag him out of this loud, meaningless room. Instead, I took a step back. Then they better be absolutely certain they are ready for it, because I do not do partial honesty. Declan's jaw tightened. He did not follow me when I walked away, but I felt his eyes burning into my spine until I cleared the double doors. 2 days later, the jealousy finally forced his hand. An anesthesiologist named Simon, a charming man with terrible taste in shoes but a genuinely kind smile, asked me out for dinner. We went to a small Italian place near the harbor. The food was excellent. Simon was engaging. We talked about medical anomalies, about our families, about our student debt. He was a perfect, safe, appropriate date. But the entire evening, while he mapped out his 10-year career plan, my mind kept dragging me back to the smell of aviation fuel and the precise way Declan tapped his coffee cup 3 times. I hated myself for it. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as dessert arrived. An emergency page. A massive multi-vehicle collision on the interstate. All available trauma surgeons were required. I apologized to Simon, threw cash on the table, and ran the 6 blocks back to the hospital. The trauma bay was a war zone. Stretchers lined the hallways. I threw on my scrubs, grabbing lead aprons and sterile gloves, instantly slipping into the brutal, mechanical focus of my job. For 6 straight hours, I drilled bones, set fractures, and stabilized bleeding. It was not until 4 in the morning that the chaos finally receded. I walked into the deserted doctor's lounge, completely drained, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. Sitting on the worn leather sofa, staring blankly at the wall, was Declan. He was still in his flight suit, covered in dirt and what looked like motor oil. He stood up immediately when I walked in. "You were out," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. I tossed my blood-splattered shoes into a corner and collapsed into an armchair, rubbing my temples. "Yes, Declan, I have a life outside of this building." Or I did, until the interstate became a parking lot. He crossed the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. His chest was rising and falling rapidly. "With Simon, from anesthesia." I dropped my hands and glared at him. "Are you monitoring my schedule now?" "He is an idiot," Declan snapped, his voice harsh. "He talks too much during transport. He misses details." I stared at him, genuinely shocked by the venom in his voice. "He is a perfectly capable doctor, and he was a very pleasant date. Why do you care?" Declan took another step forward. The distance between us evaporated. He towered over me, breathing heavily, looking like a man completely out of control. Because he gets to sit across from you in a nice restaurant. Because he gets to make you laugh without hiding it. Because he does not have to stand in a loud room in a tuxedo and pretend he is not losing his mind trying to figure out how to look at you without giving himself away. The words hit the small, sterile room like an explosive charge. I stopped breathing. The hum of the refrigerator seemed deafening. Declan stared down at me, his eyes wide, looking completely terrified by what had just left his mouth. He took a sudden, jerky step backward, running both hands violently over his face. I am sorry. I am exhausted. I should not have said that. He turned toward the door, desperate to escape. Stop, I commanded, my voice slicing through the air. He froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. I stood up slowly. My muscles ached from the surgery, but my mind was suddenly violently awake. Turn around, Declan. He turned slowly, looking everywhere but at my face. Look at me, I said. He finally brought his eyes up. They were desperate, exposed. I am not an experiment, I said, my voice dangerously low. I am not a stepping stone for you to figure out your identity. I am a 38-year-old man who fought a very long, very bloody war to be exactly who I am without apologizing for it. If you are standing there telling me what I think you are telling me, you do not get to drop a bomb like that and walk out the door. You have to stand there and own it. Declan swallowed hard. His massive shoulders slumped slightly. I do not know all the right words, Arthur, he whispered, the gravel in his voice cracking. I have only ever been with women. I have built my entire life, my career, the respect of my crew, around a very specific version of myself. And then you walked into the trauma base 6 months ago, glaring at me because my boots were tracking mud onto your sterile floor, and suddenly nothing made sense anymore. I hate it when you go on dates. I hate it when you laugh at jokes Simon makes. I want to be the one bringing you coffee, but I am terrified of what it means if I cross that line. I looked at him, feeling the absolute raw honesty bleeding out of him. It terrified me, because I realized in that moment how easily he could break me. What exactly are you asking for, Declan? I asked softly. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He stopped mere inches away. I had to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact. His hands were hovering just above his sides, trembling slightly. I am asking you to let me try to be brave. I am asking you to give me the grace to figure this out, as long as I promise to never hide you in the dark. I looked up into his face. Do you know how to kiss a man, Captain? I asked quietly. Declan let out a shuddering breath. I am hoping you will teach me. I reached up and gripped the heavy fabric of his flight suit collar. He did not hesitate. His hands came up, massive and strong, framing my face with a terrifying gentleness. When his mouth met mine, there was no hesitation. It was not clumsy. It was desperate, overwhelming, and absolute. The sterile smell of the hospital vanished, replaced entirely by the scent of rain, sweat, and him. We stumbled backward until my spine hit the wall. His body pressed flush against mine, heavy and solid. I could feel the frantic, hammered rhythm of his heart against my chest. Every wall I had built over the last 10 years began to systematically dismantle itself. The reality of daylight, however, is a vicious thing. It is easy to be brave in a locked doctor's lounge at 4 in the morning. It is entirely different standing in the glaring fluorescent lights of the hospital cafeteria at noon. The following week was a master class in psychological torture. Declan would send me texts late at night that made my chest ache with warmth, But in the hallways, surrounded by his flight crew, he became rigid. One afternoon, we were standing near the vending machines. I was exhausted, leaning casually against the glass, and I handed him a bottle of water. For a fraction of a second, my fingers brushed his. It was nothing, a microscopic point of contact, but two mechanics from the hangar were walking past, laughing loudly. Declan flinched. He physically recoiled, taking a sharp, sudden step away from me, his face completely blanking. He shoved the water bottle into his pocket and crossed his arms over his chest, putting 3 feet of solid air between us. The mechanics walked past, totally oblivious, but the damage was done. It felt like someone had taken a scalpel directly to my ribs. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I just looked at him. The panic in his eyes was immediate. "Arthur, he started. I shook my head, my face completely neutral. "Do not. Have a good flight, Captain." I turned and walked away, my posture perfectly straight, while everything inside me shattered. That night, I was standing in my kitchen in my apartment, staring blankly at a pile of unpaid bills, when the heavy knock sounded at my door. I knew it was him. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Declan stood in the hallway, looking completely wrecked. It was pouring rain outside, and his jacket was soaked, water dripping from his hair onto my hardwood floor. "Let me in," he pleaded, his voice ragged. "No," I said, gripping the edge of the door. "You can stay right there." Declan put a hand against the door frame, looking desperate. "Arthur, please." I panicked. It was instinct. I spent 20 years training myself to survive in a hyper-masculine environment. You cannot expect me to just flip a switch and undo all of that programming in a week. "I do not expect you to flip a switch," I shouted, the anger finally boiling over, echoing violently in the small hallway. "I expect you to not treat my touch like it is a contagious disease. Do you have any idea what it feels like to have the man who held you in the dark physically jump away from you in the light? It is humiliating, Declan. I spent years in the closet. I spent years calculating every movement, every glance, every word, terrified that someone would figure me out and punish me for it. I survived that. I crawled out of that box, and I swore to God I would never, ever let anyone push me back inside. And today, you shoved me right back in." Declan looked like he had been physically struck. The rain continued to run down his face, masking whatever else was in his eyes. "I am sorry," he choked out. "I know that is not enough, but I am so damn sorry. I do not want to hide you. I am terrified of losing the respect of the men I have to trust with my life in the air." "Then you have to make a choice," I said, my voice dropping back to a cold, clinical whisper. "Because you cannot have both. You cannot have the comfort of their ignorance and the reality of me. Come back when you figure out which one you want more." I closed the door in his face. I locked the deadbolt. Then I slid down the wood and sat on the floor, burying my face in my hands, listening to the heavy thud of his boots slowly walking away down the hall. For 3 weeks, the silence between us was agonizing. We worked the same traumas, we operated in the same rooms, we spoke only in absolute clinical necessities. "Scalpel, vitals are dropping, administer epinephrine." Nothing else. He looked terrible. The dark circles under his eyes deepened into permanent bruises. His movements lost their usual smooth confidence. The breaking point happened on a freezing November morning. A massive factory explosion on the edge of town sent 30 critical patients into our ER within an hour. It was absolute pandemonium. Smoke smell clung to everyone. I was in Trauma Bay 1, frantically trying to stop an arterial bleed on a machinist. Declan and his crew had just rushed the man in. They were standing near the back wall, waiting to give their handover report to the charge nurse. A paramedic from a different county, a loud, obnoxious man named Miller, was leaning against the counter, watching me work. "Looks like the fancy surgeon is finally getting his hands dirty," Miller sneered loudly to the room. "Better watch your back around him, guys. I hear Dr. Vance prefers a different kind of anatomy, if you know what I mean." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The entire trauma bay went dead silent. The monitors beeped. The nurses froze. I kept my hands buried in the patient's chest, my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. I prepared to ignore it. I prepared to swallow the bile and do my job. Before I could speak, a heavy metallic crash echoed through the room. Declan had thrown his aluminum clipboard violently onto the steel counter. The sound was like a gunshot. He crossed the room in 3 massive, terrifying strides, grabbing Miller by the front of his uniform and shoving him hard against the wall. The equipment rattled. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic piece of garbage," Declan snarled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried to every corner of the silent room. "That man is saving a life, while you stand here making jokes. And if you ever speak about my partner like that again, I will personally throw you off the roof of this hospital. Do you understand me?" Miller turned completely pale. He stammered, nodding frantically. Declan released him, shoving him away in disgust. The entire room was staring. The flight crew, the nurses, the residents. Declan did not look at any of them. He turned his back to the crowd, walked directly over to the operating table, and stood right beside me. He did not care about the blood. He did not care about the audience. He looked down at my hands, then up into my eyes. His expression was completely open, completely stripped of any armor. "What do you need, doctor?" he asked loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard him. My chest felt like it was going to shatter. The air rushed back into my lungs. I looked at the man who had just burned his own closet to the ground in front of his entire crew. "I need another clamp, Captain," I managed to say, my voice trembling only slightly. Declan nodded, stepped back, and stood guard until the surgery was finished. He did not leave my side. When the shift finally ended 12 hours later, we walked out of the hospital together. He did not flinch when we passed his co-pilot. He did not pull away when we walked past the chief of surgery. We reached the parking garage, and before I could unlock my car, Declan pinned me against the door and kissed me. It was desperate, public, and a complete surrender. "I chose," he whispered fiercely against my lips. "I choose you. I will always choose you. I am done being afraid." 3 years later, the hospital still smells like iodine and floor wax. We bought a small wooden cabin up in the foothills, 20 miles outside the city, where the air is quiet and the only noise is the wind through the pines. Our schedules are still chaotic. Sometimes I come home smelling like bone dust, and sometimes he comes home smelling like aviation fuel. But every morning, without fail, he leaves a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter for me. He is a man built out of military discipline, but he learned how to be soft. He learned that courage isn't just flying a helicopter into a blizzard. Sometimes courage is just holding my hand while we buy groceries, letting the world see exactly who we are. He asked me a wild question once, terrified of the answer. Now, the only questions we ask are whose turn it is to walk the dog, and if we have enough firewood for the winter. So, to everyone listening out there, I want to know what you think. Have you ever had to wait for someone to find their courage? Have you ever had to choose between your safety and your truth? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. And if you enjoyed this absolute roller coaster of an emergency room romance, make sure you hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Until next time, stay brave and stay true to yourselves.